The war ends quietly in Eritrea. There are no victory parades, no surrender ceremonies staged for local eyes. Instead, the end arrives through absence, through Italian officers who no longer report for duty, through pay chits that stop being issued, through commands that simply fall silent. For the Eritrean Ascari, men who had served the Italian state in uniform for decades, the collapse of authority does not feel like liberation. It feels like the ground is giving way beneath their feet. The rituals that had once marked military life, roll calls, inspections, written orders, fade without replacement, leaving uncertainty where routine had once been. For nearly half a century, Italian rule had shaped Eritrea's military world. From the late 19th century onward, the Ascari were recruited, trained and disciplined as part of a colonial army that relied heavily on African soldiers. They marched under Italian flags, wore Italian insignia, and fought in campaigns far beyond Eritrea itself. Libya, Somalia, Ethiopia. Service was not informal, it was contractual, regulated, and deeply woven into everyday life. Military wages supported families, rank carried social meaning, uniforms distinguished soldiers from civilians. The state, however distant or unequal, was present in predictable ways. That presence collapses with startling speed in 1941. British and Commonwealth forces defeat Italian troops in East Africa and assume control of Eritrea. Italian command structures disintegrate almost overnight. Barracks empty, armories are seized. Senior officers surrender or are interned. Pay offices close without notice. What remains are thousands of Eritrean soldiers standing in formation without commanders, uniforms growing threadbare, waiting for instructions that never come. Some continue to report for duty out of habit alone, unsure whether discipline still binds them. Some Ascari are told to go home, others are advised to remain nearby in case they are needed. Few receive written orders, fewer still are formally discharged. The war for them ends without paperwork. This administrative silence becomes the defining feature of the aftermath. Without documents, the service cannot be proven. Without proof, rights cannot be claimed. What had once been a bureaucratic system of control now collapses into a void of responsibility. British military administration steps in with limited aims. Eritrea is not a prize to be integrated, but a territory to be managed while the larger war continues. Stability is the priority. Ports like Masawa must function, roads must remain secure, cities must be policed with minimal disruption. Former Ascari, with their training and local knowledge, are an obvious resource. Quietly, pragmatically, they are employed where useful, often through verbal agreements rather than contracts. Yet this employment carries no recognition of past service. The British do not treat the Ascari as allied veterans, nor as prisoners of war. They occupy an undefined category. They are not enemies, but neither are they allies. They are simply available manpower. Wages, where paid, are irregular and lower than Italian military salaries. There is no mention of pensions, rank equivalents, or future obligations. Temporary necessity replaces formal responsibility. For many former soldiers, this ambiguity is destabilizing. Under Italian rule, however unequal, the rules were known. Pay arrived on schedule. Promotion followed years of service. After 1941, nothing is guaranteed. Men who had spent most of their adult lives in uniform are suddenly forced to negotiate daily survival as civilians without preparation. The loss is not only economic, it is psychological. Military identity had offered structure and predictability. Its disappearance leaves a void that neither British administration nor civilian life is prepared to fill. Communities feel the effects quickly. Families that relied on military income must adapt to irregular wages or none at all. Villages receive men who return without savings, without status, and without clarity about whether their service is finished or merely paused. Rumours fill the silence. Some believe Italy will return after the war, others expect Britain to assume responsibility for pensions. Still others fear punishment for having served a defeated empire. British officials are aware of the uncertainty, but reluctant to resolve it. Eritrea's political future is undecided, and long-term commitments are avoided. Reports describe former Ascari as disciplined and generally cooperative, but also as a potential political problem. Recognizing their service might imply obligations Britain is unwilling to accept. Ignoring it, however, risks resentment that could complicate administration. By the mid-1940s, the pattern is clear. The Italian state that recruited and commanded the Ascari no longer exists in Eritrea. The British administration governs without inheriting Italy's responsibilities. Between these two facts lies a generation of soldiers whose contracts have vanished without conclusion. As the global war edges toward its end, Eritrea remains in limbo. The Ascari wait with it. They have survived combat, discipline, and empire. What they face now is quieter but more enduring. The disappearance of the state that once gave their service meaning, and the unanswered question of who, if anyone, will acknowledge what they gave. A soldier without an army still has skills someone wants. In the years after Italy's defeat, that quiet truth shapes daily life for former Ascari across Eritrea. Demobilization has stripped them of rank and uniform, but it has not erased what they know how to do or what others believe they can do. Training does not vanish with paperwork. Discipline lingers in posture, speech, and habit, marking these men even when they try to blend back into civilian life. By the mid-1940s, Eritrea's towns and ports were crowded with transition. British administrators run a territory never meant to be permanent. Italian civilians linger, uncertain of their own futures, and often protected by informal networks. Trade resumes unevenly through Masawa and Asmara, while rural districts struggle with shortages, disrupted agriculture, and population movement. Security is thin, British manpower is limited. The presence of thousands of trained former soldiers becomes both an opportunity and a problem, useful but potentially destabilizing if mishandled. Many Ascari find work almost immediately, though rarely on paper. British officers, district commissioners, and port authorities turn to them for guarding depots, escorting convoys, watching rail lines, and keeping order around docks and markets. These jobs come without ceremonial enlistment or public acknowledgement. Pay is irregular, sometimes issued in cash, sometimes delayed for weeks. Contracts, if they exist, are short-term and can be revoked at any time. The men are employed not as soldiers but as watchmen, guards, or labor auxiliaries, titles that deliberately avoid military recognition and limit future claims. This arrangement keeps food moving and violence contained, but it carries a cost. Informal employment offers survival without security. A man can be useful 1 month and expendable the next. Injuries bring no pension. Death brings no compensation. Dismissal brings no appeal. The same skills that make former Ascari employable also trap them in a narrow economic lane, reinforcing their identity as men of force rather than men of citizenship. The boundary between service and servitude becomes thin. Stigma follows closely behind. In towns, some Eritreans see these veterans as reminders of Italian domination, men who enforced colonial order, however constrained their choices had been. Others understand the desperation that led young men to enlist decades earlier, but sympathy does not translate into opportunity. Employers value obedience more than advancement. For many former Ascari, survival means accepting work that deepens social distance even as it pays the day's wages. British officials are uneasy too. Reports from the period show concern about concentrating armed or semi-armed men without clear loyalty. Weapons are monitored, ammunition is restricted, groups are broken up deliberately. Employment is fragmented to prevent organization or collective identity. The goal is stability, not reintegration. Order today matters more than belonging tomorrow. Across Eritrea's ports, especially Masawa, this tension is visible. Former Ascari guard warehouses filled with goods they did not own, enforcing rules written in languages they did not understand. They stand between British authority and local labor, mediating disputes without authority to resolve them. Their presence keeps commerce flowing, but it also reinforces the sense that they exist on the margins of every system they serve, essential yet replaceable. In rural areas the pattern differs, but the outcome is similar. Some veterans return to farming, carrying military discipline into village life, becoming informal organizers or enforcers of order. Others migrate toward towns in search of paid work, swelling urban populations already under strain. A few cross borders into Sudan, drawn by rumors of opportunity or simply by the hope that anonymity might offer a fresh start. None of these paths comes with recognition of past service. What does not emerge is a unified veterans movement. The conditions are wrong for it. Employment is scattered, communities are divided, records are missing. British policy actively discourages collective organization among former colonial soldiers. Survival remains an individual calculation, made week by week, not a shared political cause. By the late 1940s, this way of life began to harden into expectation. Temporary security work becomes a long-term substitute for a military career that ended without ceremony. The absence of pensions or official status forces men to rely on adaptability rather than rights. Skills learned in uniform are repurposed, but never honored. The deeper consequence lies ahead. Each year spent in informal service delays reintegration into civilian society. Each month without recognition makes future claims easier to dismiss. What begins as pragmatic employment slowly turns into structural exclusion, shaping how these men will be seen when larger political decisions finally arrive. For now, they endure, they work, they guard the remnants of empires that no longer claim them, and without realizing it, the strategies that allow them to survive today are quietly narrowing the possibilities they will be offered tomorrow. A medal can survive a war, a pension file often does not. For many former Eritrean Ascari, the years after 1945 are defined less by memory than by paperwork. Documents requested, lost, denied, or never created at all. What had once been a system of enlistment and service now becomes a maze of forms, offices, and legal thresholds that few veterans are equipped to navigate. When the Italian Republic was proclaimed on the 2nd of June 1946, the symbolic break with fascism raised cautious hopes among colonial veterans. Italy is redefining itself. Its former empire is gone. The assumption among many Ascari is simple. If the state has changed, obligations might finally be clarified. Instead, the legal ground beneath their service becomes more uncertain than ever. A regime has fallen, but no replacement institution explicitly accepts responsibility for colonial soldiers. The Treaty of Paris, signed on the 10th of February 1947, formally ended Italy's colonial rule. Eritrea is no longer Italian territory, and Italy is no longer a colonial power. Responsibility for former colonial soldiers, however, is not clearly transferred. Pensions had been administered through imperial institutions that no longer exist. New Italian ministries inherit fragments of old records, incomplete lists, and competing interpretations of responsibility. Each administrative layer introduces delay rather than resolution. For Eritrean veterans, distance becomes an obstacle as real as law. Pension claims require documentation, enlistment dates, discharge papers, and proof of continuous service. Many of these documents were destroyed during the war or abandoned during the Italian collapse of 1941. Others exist only in archives thousands of kilometers away, in a country struggling with its own post-war poverty, housing shortages, and political reorganization. Correspondence takes months. Replies, when they arrive, are often inconclusive. Even when records can be reconstructed, colonial categories intervene. Italian pension law had never treated colonial soldiers as equal to metropolitan ones. Benefits were graded by race, rank, and type of service. These hierarchies survive the fall of the empire, embedded in administrative language that frames Ascari service as auxiliary rather than essential. Claims are processed slowly, if at all, and approval often results in reduced or symbolic payments rather than full pensions. Some veterans organize petitions, others rely on intermediaries, Italian settlers, lawyers, former officers, who agree to help navigate the bureaucracy, sometimes for a fee. British administrators occasionally forward inquiries but rarely advocate strongly. Eritrea, under British military administration, lacks standing in Italian courts. Veterans are told, in effect, that their case belongs elsewhere, even as no authority accepts it. Time works against them. Each delay weakens memory. Each missing document becomes grounds for rejection. Archival figures suggest small numbers of pensions are approved, often partial and delayed, while many more claims remain unresolved or quietly dismissed. Reports from the period speak of exceptional cases, a phrase that reveals how rare recognition has become. The emotional toll is heavy. Service that once brought pride now seems to carry no legal weight. Medals, uniforms, and photographs testify to loyalty that no institution will acknowledge. Families age while waiting. Widows inherit claims but not answers. What was once a promise of lifelong support fades into a series of unanswered letters and deferred decisions. Italy's post-war culture plays a role as well. The nation's public memory focuses on resistance and victimhood, not colonial responsibility. The wars in Africa are reframed as distant, regrettable episodes, better forgotten than settled. In this climate, the claims of African soldiers draw little attention or sympathy, and bureaucratic neglect is easily justified as a technical necessity. By the early 1950s, a pattern is clear. Recognition deferred has become recognition denied. The absence of clear responsibility allows every authority involved, Italy, Britain, and emerging international bodies to step aside. Each can argue with technical accuracy that the obligation lies elsewhere. For the veterans, the result is the same. Years of service dissolve into administrative silence. The war has ended, the files are closed, and the question of who owes them remains unanswered, not because it is too complex to resolve, but because it has become too easy to ignore. Parades remember victories, they forget the rank and file. In the years after the war, this quiet truth settles over the former Ascari as firmly as any official decree. Their service survives in fragments, photographs, medals, stories told within families, but it finds no place in the public memory of the powers that once commanded them. Without official recognition, remembrance becomes a private act rather than a civic one. In Italy, the late 1940s and 1950s were years of selective remembrance. The nation rebuilds itself around narratives of resistance, suffering, and renewal. Fascism is treated as a rupture, an aberration to be condemned and then set aside. Colonial wars in Africa do not fit easily into this story. They are distant, morally uncomfortable, and politically inconvenient. The soldiers who fought them, especially African soldiers, fade from view as Italy constructs a memory that emphasizes victimhood over responsibility. There are no monuments erected for the Ascari in post-war Italy. No national ceremonies recall their campaigns. School curricula and public commemorations bypass colonial service almost entirely. Military histories focus on European fronts or on Italian suffering under occupation. When Africa appears, it is often as background or failure, not as a site of obligation. Silence becomes a form of policy, even when it is never formally declared or debated. In Eritrea, memory takes a different shape. The British military administration shows little interest in commemorating Italian colonial service. Its legitimacy rests on its distance from the previous regime, not on its continuity with it. Public ceremonies avoid celebrating the colonial past, and former Ascari are rarely acknowledged as veterans in any official capacity. Their service is treated as an administrative inconvenience rather than a historical fact requiring resolution. Within Eritrean society itself, memory fractures. Some communities remember Ascari service as a path taken under constraint, shaped by poverty, coercion, or limited options. Others recall it as a collaboration, however unequal the relationship had been. These interpretations coexist uneasily, often within the same families. A father's uniform may represent survival to one generation and shame to another, complicating the inheritance of memory itself. What is missing is a shared civic language to hold these experiences together. Without recognition from the state, any state, memory remains private. Stories circulate in homes, not schools. Medals are kept in drawers, not museums. The past is remembered, but not publicly validated. This absence denies former Ascari a place within collective narratives of sacrifice or nationhood. This absence matters. Memory is not only about honor, it is about belonging. Without monuments, without official acknowledgement, former Ascari are excluded from the moral community of veterans. Their sacrifices are not denied outright, they are simply unrecorded. The effect is subtle but lasting, shaping how these men see authority and how future promises are judged. Italian archival silence reinforces this pattern. Records exist, but they are rarely activated in public discourse. The men appear as statistics or footnotes, not as agents with lives beyond the battlefield. When colonial history is discussed at all, it is often framed through the actions of Italian officers, not the experiences of African soldiers who bore the risks and losses. Yet memory does not disappear entirely. In Eritrea, former Ascari continue to shape political conversations indirectly. Their presence, visible in security roles, port work and policing, keeps colonial history close to the surface. Younger Eritreans encounter these men not as figures of the past, but as neighbors whose lives have been shaped by unresolved questions of loyalty and reward. This quiet influence is easily overlooked. Without monuments or ceremonies, it does not announce itself, but it informs how authority is perceived, how foreign rule is remembered, and how promises are judged. The lesson absorbed is not one of heroism, but of abandonment. By the 1950s, the absence of public memory begins to carry political weight. As Eritrea's future becomes a subject of international debate, veterans watch discussions unfold without reference to their service. Their history is not contested, it is irrelevant. Decisions about sovereignty proceed as if their lives had not intersected with empire at all. Silence, in this sense, is not neutral. It narrows the space in which former Ascari can claim dignity without apology. It leaves them vulnerable to being defined entirely by others, by accusations of collaboration or by romanticized myths that ignore material neglect. Still, the men endure. They age, they work, they tell their stories quietly, and in doing so they ensure that memory survives, even without monuments. What remains uncertain is whether this private remembrance will ever find a public voice, or whether the soldiers who helped hold an empire together will pass from living memory without leaving a mark on the histories written in their name. Veterans watch diplomats decide their homeland's fate. By the late 1940s, the future of Eritrea is no longer argued in barracks or district offices, but in meeting rooms far away, where maps and memoranda stand in for lived experience. For former Ascari, the shift is profound. The question that has shadowed them since demobilization, who do we belong to now, moves from the margins of administration to the center of international politics, even as their own voices remain peripheral. After years of British military administration, Eritrea's status became a matter for the United Nations. The collapse of Italian rule has created a vacuum that no single power is willing or able to fill outright. Britain administers but does not claim. Italy is defeated and discredited. Ethiopia asserts historical ties. International bodies frame the problem as one of self-determination, stability, and regional balance. None of these frameworks was designed to address obligations owed to colonial soldiers. In 1949, the UN Commission for Eritrea arrived to gather testimony. Its mandate is limited, its timetable tight. Commissioners travel, listen, record, and move on. They hear from political organizations, religious leaders, trade groups, and local elites. Veterans are not a formal constituency, but their voices surface indirectly through petitions, letters, and brief statements that speak less about ideology than about livelihood, pensions, and the desire for legal clarity. For former Ascari, the hearings are both an opportunity and a reminder of distance. Some hope that international attention might finally address pensions, employment, or recognition. Others simply want certainty. A state that will claim them, even imperfectly, is better than none at all. Yet their appeals are filtered through translators, summarized in reports, and subordinated to larger constitutional questions. The language of rights competes with the language of administration and usually loses. Resolution 390 AV, adopted in 1950, proposes federation with Ethiopia. Eritrea will retain its own institutions under the sovereignty of the Ethiopian crown. On paper, the solution promises balance, local autonomy within a recognized state. For veterans, the implications are uncertain. Federation resolves borders, but it does not automatically resolve status, pensions, or recognition of past service under Italy. As discussions continue, British administrators begin preparing for withdrawal. Temporary arrangements become final ones. Files are closed, responsibilities are handed over, sometimes hurriedly and without consultation. Former Ascari, who have relied on British employment, mediation, or informal protection since the ground shifting beneath them once again, repeating the experience of 1941 in quieter form. During the transition, veterans' concerns are rarely central. International deliberations focus on language rights, administrative structures, and political representation. The everyday realities of demobilized soldiers, aging, underemployed, undocumented, sit awkwardly within this framework. The UN process recognizes peoples and territories, not service records or broken contracts. When the federation took effect on the 15th of September 1952, Eritrea entered a new political order. Ethiopian authorities inherit a population shaped by decades of Italian rule and a decade of British administration. For former Ascari, the change brings both possibilities and risk. Ethiopian security services value military experience, but incorporation is selective. Some veterans find work, others are excluded or overlooked, depending on timing, loyalty, and local discretion. The promise of belonging remains conditional. Federation offers citizenship in principle, but recognition in practice depends on usefulness, political alignment, and administrative need. Past service under Italy neither fully disqualifies nor fully qualifies a man for inclusion. It simply complicates every assessment. What the UN process does accomplish is a reframing of the veterans' predicament. Their marginalization is no longer solely a colonial residue, it is embedded in the structure of international decision-making. By treating Eritrea's future as a question of governance rather than obligation, the process sidelines unresolved debts of service. For many former Ascari, this is a familiar pattern. Authority changes hands, but accountability does not. Each transition promises closure, yet delivers another layer of administration that inherits problems without claiming responsibility for their origins. As the commissioners depart and flags change once more, veterans return to daily calculations, work, family, survival. The grand language of international law offers little guidance for navigating a life shaped by service to a vanished empire. The Federation has resolved a diplomatic problem, but it has not answered the personal one that has followed it since 1941. They watch as new institutions take shape, wondering whether this state, too, will remember them only when convenient. The question of belonging remains open, not because no decision has been made, but because the decisions that matter most have yet to reach them. New sovereignty brings old hierarchies back. In the early 1950s, as Eritrea settled into federation with Ethiopia, former Ascari find themselves navigating yet another political landscape shaped by power they do not control. The empire that once claimed their loyalty is gone, but its shadows linger in the institutions, assumptions, and security practices that replace it. What changes is the flag. What remains is uncertainty. Ethiopian authorities approach Eritrea with a mix of caution and ambition. The region is strategically important, and its population has been shaped by decades of foreign rule. Security is a priority. Experience matters. Former Ascari possess training, discipline, and familiarity with military order. For some, this opens doors. Select veterans are recruited into police forces, local militias, or auxiliary security roles. Their service continues, but under a new flag, with new oaths that offer authority without continuity of recognition. For others, the transition brings exclusion. Past service under Italy becomes a liability rather than an asset, especially in a political climate suspicious of colonial legacies. Incorporation is uneven, influenced by local officials, perceived loyalty, language, religion, and the immediate needs of security forces. There is no comprehensive program to absorb former colonial soldiers. Instead, selection reinforces inequality among veterans themselves, dividing those who find renewed purpose from those left behind. Italian responsibility recedes further into abstraction. Pension claims remain unresolved. Communication with Italian authorities grows more distant as years pass. Archives close, officials change. The idea that Italy might still owe something to African soldiers who served its empire fades from practical consideration, even as the legal ambiguity remains unresolved. Obligation survives only as memory. For those excluded from Ethiopian service, adaptation becomes essential. Some veterans migrate in search of work, moving towards Sudan or other neighboring regions where their past is less known and their skills might still command wages. Others remain in Eritrea, turning again to informal security work, labor, or small trade. Military skills are repurposed into private survival strategies rather than public service, reinforcing the sense that authority no longer belongs to them. Identity becomes increasingly fragmented. These men have served under Italy, lived under Britain, and now exist within Ethiopian sovereignty. Each transition strips away another layer of certainty without fully replacing it. Uniforms change, titles disappear, loyalty becomes something practiced cautiously, if at all, shaped by experience rather than ideology. Families feel the strain. Children grow up hearing stories of service that carry little tangible reward. Respect within the household does not translate into status beyond it. Aging veterans confront the reality that their working years are ending without the safety net once promised. Dependency replaces independence, often quietly and without complaint. By the mid-1950s, the pattern was set. Service continues for some, recognition for a few. The structures of empire have shifted, but the fundamental imbalance remains. Trained soldiers without secure citizenship, veterans without veterans' rights. This condition shapes how authority is understood. The lesson absorbed is not simply that empires fall, but that they leave obligations unresolved. Trust in official promises erodes. Pragmatism replaces loyalty. Survival becomes the primary measure of success. As Eritrea moves deeper into its federated existence, former Ascari stand at the intersection of histories that refuse to acknowledge them fully. They belong everywhere in experience and nowhere in law, and as new political tensions begin to surface, their quiet, unresolved presence hints at consequences yet to come, of service given, debts unpaid, and allegiance asked for again without assurance that this time will be different. A generation ages before its story is written. By the late 1950s, the former Ascari were no longer men in uniform or even men in their prime. They are workers with worn hands, elders with memories that have outlasted the institutions that once gave them meaning. The war that defined their early lives has receded into history, but its consequences remain present in their bodies, families, and prospects. What was once a shared military identity dissolves into individual biographies shaped by uneven survival. Time exposes what transition concealed. Temporary work becomes permanent insecurity. Informal arrangements harden into ceilings that cannot be crossed. Those who found places in policing or security age out without pensions or formal retirement. Those who migrated return or do not. Illness replaces injury as the primary risk, and without veteran status, support depends on kin, community, or charity. The promises once attached to service, steady pay, retirement, recognition, exist now only as remembered expectations. Yet service leaves traces. Military discipline shapes households and neighborhoods. Ideas about order, hierarchy, and obligation are passed down to children who did not wear uniforms but grew up under their shadow. Stories of marches and commands mix with stories of abandonment and delay. The lesson is complex. Loyalty can be demanded, but it is not guaranteed to be repaid. Authority is learned as something to be navigated, not as something to be trusted. Across Eritrea and its borders, former Ascari contribute to the texture of public life in quiet ways. They train guards, advise younger men, and model a professionalism learned under foreign rule. This transmission is not ideological, it is practical. Skills endure even when the state that taught them has vanished. Military culture, once imposed, becomes locally embedded, shaping behavior long after its original purpose has faded. Comparisons with other former colonial soldiers only sharpen the contrast. In some territories, demobilization came with recognition, however limited. In others, veterans were folded into new national armies. For the Ascari, neither outcome fully arrives. Their experience sits between cases, shaped by the unique sequence of Italian collapse, British administration, international mediation, and federation. Each stage defers resolution, and together they normalize neglect. By the early 1960s, Eritrea stood on the edge of a new chapter. Political tensions deepen. Younger generations articulate grievances in languages shaped by law, nationalism, and rights. The veterans' experiences do not cause these tensions, but they inform them. Structural neglect has consequences. When obligations are left unresolved, trust erodes across time, leaving institutions brittle when challenged. It would be a mistake to read this backward as inevitability. The former Ascari are not symbols of destiny or proof of a single political outcome. Their lives show something more precise: how empires manage endings, and how those endings are lived by the people who carried rifles on their behalf. Demobilization without transfer creates long shadows. Recognition delayed becomes recognition denied. In old age, many veterans do not ask for monuments. They ask for acknowledgement that their service existed, that it mattered, that it carried obligations which outlived the regimes that created them. Some receive small pensions late, many receive nothing. All carry the knowledge that the war's end did not end its responsibilities. The afterlives of service are not dramatic. They unfold in kitchens, ports, and side streets, in family stories told without ceremony. But they matter. They explain how political cultures absorb disappointment, how authority is judged, and how loyalty is measured against experience. The Second World War ended in Eritrea without a final order for the men who had fought it. What followed was not a single failure, but a series of deferrals, each reasonable in isolation, together decisive in effect. The lesson is not about blame alone, it is about obligation. Wars end, empires fall. But the duties created by service do not dissolve on their own. When they are ignored, they do not disappear. They wait, quietly, persistently, within the lives of those who were promised that victory would mean an ending, and discovered instead that it was only another beginning. Remembering forgotten soldiers keeps history honest and prevents silence from becoming the final verdict. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story so their service is not lost again. Every view helps turn overlooked lives into recorded history.